First up, it's been a shocking 2 weeks for the Prime Minister. After promising not to change stage 3 tax cuts and telling us he was a man of his word, Albo backflipped big. He sold us a total pup at the federal election. The PM is in free fall and it's reflected in the polls. From the divisive voice referendum to his government's lack of action on the cost of living crisis, how can voters trust him again? So our first question for the jury is Albanese a one-term Prime Minister? Joining me now is Shadow Indigenous Affairs Minister Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Labor Councillor Linda Scott. Great to see you both. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Jacinta, we'll start with you. 6 months ago, nobody thought we would probably be having this conversation. It just felt like the honeymoon for Anthony Albanese was never ending. He was popular in the polling. Then came the voice referendum. And after that, the polls were sliding. Do you think it was a voice referendum that sealed his fate as a one-term Prime Minister?
Well, to be very honest with you, Danica, I think the Prime Minister from the outset has demonstrated to the Australian people just how deceitful he can be and how he is unable to lead this nation. And aside from the referendum, it began with his promise to reduce Australians' electricity bills by $275. Now, the referendum showed us all how he would prefer to lead with ideological ways forward as opposed to common sense ways of supporting certainly our most marginalised and dividing our nation along the lines of race. We heard many of the arguments throughout the referendum, but mostly the fact that there was absolutely no detail. So Australians were left to determine what exactly the voice was about. It was not demonstrated with any clarity how it was supposed to improve the lives of our most marginalised, and therefore Australians, I believe, looked through the Prime Minister's deception. And that is why we had the result that we had with the referendum, and the circumstances certainly have not changed on the ground for our most marginalised going forward. And of course, as you've mentioned, with the current proposed new tax cuts,
yes,
he's backflipped, and he continues to backflip to the Australian people.
Yeah, and this is the problem now, Linda, is there's a credibility issue because he's come out and said, I am a man of my word, but he's backflipped on a key election promise. He also made Australians go to the polls in the middle of a cost of living crisis to vote on something that they simply weren't interested in. Has this impacted him now moving forward?
I think that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will proudly run on his record into the next election, and that is a record of creating 561,000 new jobs, the fastest growing job record for a government. He's got a great record of $23 billion of cost of living relief. And of course, the latest decision to provide every tax-paying Australian with a tax cut is the right decision for this time. I think nobody could accuse the Prime Minister of not making a decision here in the interests of all Australians, and that's what he's done. The real question now is whether Peter Dutton and the opposition will stand in the way of every working Australian getting some form of tax relief.
Well, I guess this tax relief, though, the changes, Middle Australia will only end up with about $16 extra a week. Given that the cost of petrol's gone up, rental, the housing crisis, is that really enough? Why should voters be thanking him?
Well, voters should be looking at their decision at the next election in light of the record. And I think what we've seen from Prime Minister Albanese is an incredible record of focusing policy area after policy area towards their cost of living relief. We're talking about cheaper childcare. We're talking about free TAFE places. We're talking about getting real wages moving for the first time in a decade. Rent relief, income relief for those on our lowest incomes in Australia. This whole $23 billion package of cost of living relief is making a difference, and it's doing so and not increasing the pressure on inflation. That's a really economically challenging thing to do, but Anthony Albanese and his government have delivered the right outcome for Australia. It's what we need now.
I guess Jacinta, the big test will now be the Dunkley by-election, which is coming up in March. Labor should theoretically be quite safe with that seat. It's held on a margin of just over 6%. If Labor retain Dunkley, how will you argue against the changes to the tax cuts?
Look, I think these decisions are decisions that have been made on the run by the Prime Minister. I mean, you know, we're talking about sort of a short-term solution. If we look forward, Treasury has demonstrated recently through their documents that it will be at a cost of $28 billion in the next 10 years, and somebody has to pay for that. And unfortunately, you know, I've yet to see, and these tax cuts are supposed to take place in July. People are hurting right now because of the cost of living. I don't see any immediate relief for the Australian people when you've got a situation where you have people who are on multiple incomes who are still seeking support from organisations like the Salvation Army. It's just not working. And again, it's another broken promise that's been made to the Australian people. What more are we going to see from this Prime Minister going forward? He just cannot be trusted.
All right, let's get the jury to weigh in here. Susan, in the front row, we'll start with you. How are you feeling about Anthony Albanese right now? He was elected, very popular man. He's backflipped on a lot of key policies. Where do you sit with him?
Well, I mean, I'm a long-time Labor voter, but I'm a long-time Canberra resident, and I basically, in my lifetime, politicians have got caught lying about stuff, various stuff. So and like I'm going to benefit because like I'm a low-income earner. But so to me, he could have probably backflipped worse on another issue. But I can see with this that he made the decision, like at this moment, he made that decision. But to me, like I'm not someone that's going, oh, he lied. But I do find generally politicians do get caught that one day they'll say something and then the next day they'll say something else.
Well, I mean, again, and I hate to be cynical, Jacinta, but has Susan got a point there? That's the politician lifestyle.
Well, look, I mean, there is the fact that the record of this Prime Minister is continuously backflipping. As we saw in the referendum also, the gaslighting of the Australian people when he denied that the Uluru Statement from the heart was, you know, a particular length in terms of it being a document, or whether he's going to pursue truth or treaty going forward, and what that means for the Australian people. We're still in the dark on that. He came to Alice Springs this time last year because he was shamed into finally coming as the Prime Minister to see the destruction on our streets. Yep. He made a promise of $250 million. It has not made a single difference. And the issues are still the same that we're faced with.
I want to ask another juror, Tate, how are you feeling about how the Prime Minister's going right now?
I mean, the fact is that, you know, Jim and Albo keep sitting there saying that we're delivering a tax cut to everyone, but the truth of the matter is they had to steal from some Australians to give that money to other Australians. So it's not a tax cut for everyone. He had to redistribute money from people that actually pay a higher amount of tax in general and actually deserve that money, and were relying on that money. Now, apparently last year the referendum was so important, even though it was going to fail, because he was a man of his word. But now that word means nothing when there's a by-election in Dunkley and he gives everyone $20 and wears a pink bucket hat. We're all meant to believe him. So I think he probably will get another term because history dictates that we will let him, but it certainly won't be on my vote.
And see, this is the perception now, Linda, that we were talking about, that he has backflipped on that promise. And even in Dunkley, even a narrow victory, surely that would be fatal for Anthony Albanese's leadership moving forward.
Well, I think we know that governments do struggle in by-elections, and Australian voters historically do tend to use them if they wish to send a message to the government. So I actually think that Labor has a hard but possible task in the Dunkley by-election. The job of the government, though, is to listen to the people, to make sure that they're doing what's in the public interest. And I think over time, as Australians assess the possibilities of having Peter Dutton as their Prime Minister, a return to dysfunction and division and culture wars, they'll look favourably on the prospect of having Prime Minister Albanese serve another term. Because let's just remember that record, actually cutting under the Abbott government $500 million from remote Indigenous communities, and during Labor's term opposing income support increases, opposing rises in real wages. These are the things that Australians want their government to be doing. We're yet to see if he'll oppose the tax tax cuts for all Australians.
Yes.
But these are important things that Australians want to see government delivering.
Jacinta, I'll just give you the final word on that realistically. Is Peter Dutton the man that's going to take over from Anthony Albanese?
Well, I think if all the Prime Minister has is to try to compare himself to Peter Dutton, he's got a long way to go before he can convince the Australian people that he can continue, because his leadership has been abysmal. And certainly in the area that I'm concerned with, he has failed to support my call for an inquiry into land councils, the statutory authorities and the spending that goes on with for our most marginalised Indigenous Australians, so that we can better support those people. He's failed to actually acknowledge any of those very critical issues. So.
OK. All right. Well, look, you've both had your say on the matter. It's time to call now on the jury. Jurors, you have 10 seconds to decide. Is Albanese a one-term Prime Minister? OK, time is up. Jury, what is your verdict? OK, there is an overwhelming yes, so 11 of you voted yes, 1 voted no, and overwhelming that they do believe that Anthony Albanese is a one-term Prime Minister. I'll just ask you, Susan, why have you kept your vote as no? We spoke to you before, but why do you really believe that Anthony Albanese still has your vote?
Because, I mean, well, I'll always vote for the Labor Party.
Yeah.
Like I was saying to people in the jury, like I have a disability, and so I do find my ideology, it suits the Labor Party ideology.
Okay.
So I'd always vote for the Labor Party. Okay. And I still think there's time between now and the next election. You don't know what'll happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
And so, but I'd always vote Labor.
Okay, so it hasn't changed your vote then.
No.
Bruce, right next to you, you were one who voted overwhelmingly yes. Why?
I think this is the worst government in the nation's history. I think Australians are waking up to what life is like under a socialist regime, given the fact that they mess up every single subject area that they touch. In my personal view, Albo's a dead man walking.
That's pretty strong words there. Dead man walking, you're adamant.
Absolutely.
Linda, we'll just get a final comment. How do you feel hearing that?
Well, look, I respect the jury from Sky News. You know, is going to have a strong view, perhaps that is not particularly necessarily representative of the Australian population. I think there's a long time between now and the election, and I think that Prime Minister Albanese and his team will continue to do the right thing by all Australians and make decisions in the public interest, and I hope Australians reward that come election time.
OK, well, it's going to be a big year ahead. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price and Linda Scott, thank you to both of you for joining us this evening. All right, let's move on and see how the jury votes on our next big question. Just this month, Australia's population surged past 27 million people, nearly 2 decades earlier than expected. This growth is equivalent to 1 new Australian every 50 seconds. Jim Chalmers said annual net overseas migration for the 2022 to 2023 financial year was likely to be 350,000. Last year, it was estimated to have hit 500,000 people in the year to September. Yet debate on the matter is stifled. Some on the left say it's racist or xenophobic to even question immigration levels, while others on the right want a plebiscite on population policy. For them, it's about logistics. Housing demand is outstripping supply, an infrastructure backlog, traffic congestion, services like schools and hospitals. Can they keep up? So are we paying the price for a big Australia? Our next question for the jury: should Australia reduce its immigration intake? Joining us to discuss is Australian entrepreneur and businessman Dick Smith, who thinks we should reduce the current migration rate, and policy analyst at the Centre for Independent Studies, Emilie Dye, who doesn't want migration numbers to be cut back. Panel, hello to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Dick, we'll start with you. Australia's population is expected to almost double in the next 5 decades. Can we continue on that trajectory?
Well, we can, but it won't be good for normal people. It'll be great for the wealthy. They'll make even more money. Our billionaires have doubled their wealth in 5 years. They'll keep being wealthier. The figures are actually worse. At the present growth rate from the huge immigration, we're going to end up at 100 million people in Australia when our grandkids will still be alive at the end of this century. Now, no one believes 100 million is sensible for an arid country like Australia.
OK, last year 500,000 migrants. Give me a figure. What should be the annual figure?
The figure should be about 75,000 a year. Up until Paul Keating, when he was Prime Minister, I'm pro-immigration.
Yeah.
I think it's really fantastic. But 75,000 a year will round off our population at about 30 million, and that sounds a pretty sensible number to me. Having more people normally means you're spreading the wealth, and with more people, everyone gets less.
OK, Emilie, you are a migrant yourself. You
Yes.
came to Australia 5 years ago from the US. Back then in the 2019-2020 financial year, the population of Australia increased by 194,000 due to migration levels. As we've heard, yes, last year it was 500,000. Realistically, how could you support the current rate of migration?
I don't think that it is a finite number of resources. I think that immigrants are adding value. I think it's really easy to look at immigration and say, oh, immigrants are they're taking our jobs, or they're taking our houses. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. For every job that an immigrant's taking, they're also creating jobs. They are both consuming and they're creating their own businesses. Immigrants tend to be incredibly entrepreneurial, so they're adding back to the country. They are the ones that are often working on the construction crews, building those houses. So it's easy to blame immigrants for policy failures, for issues like housing affordability. But when it comes down to it, in general, immigrants are just adding to our society and making us richer, making us all richer, not just the people at the top.
OK, well, some have said that Australia's immigration program is that of a Ponzi scheme, that realistically politicians rely on immigration to, for example, prop up the GDP. What would you say to that?
I think that it's not propping up, that they're adding real value.
Right.
It's not fake value. It's not fake money that's coming into this country. These are real businesses. These are real people that are doing real jobs and coming up with ideas, increasing our productivity, being entrepreneurs. Immigrants tend to be the most entrepreneurial people out there because they're at a disadvantage when they come to this country. They don't necessarily have the connections. They can't say to their mate, oh, like we went to the same school, can you get me a job?
Yeah.
They can't do that. So they often end up being the ones that start those businesses that are adding. So maybe you can call it a Ponzi scheme, but in reality, it's real money and it's real businesses and real people.
Well, Dick, you're an entrepreneur yourself. I mean, are migrants now taking those positions?
No, but here's the problem. We're not a manufacturing country like China.
Okay.
We actually make our money exporting minerals and primary industry. And you don't actually need a lot more people to do that. So my belief is double the number of people in the country and most people are worth half as much. And a good example of a country with a small population is Norway. It has 5 million population. It's similar to Australia. It makes its money not from manufacturing, but from selling oil and gas, just as we sell minerals. And their GDP per head is a third more than ours. In other words, they're more successful than us with a 5 million population. That's sensible. Look, every Australian family has a population plan. They don't have 20 kids. They have the number of kids they can give a good life to. Our politicians should have the number of people in Australia we can give a good life to. That's not happening at the moment. Young people can't afford a house.
Yeah.
You're in traffic gridlock. Things are getting worse and worse.
But what about there's also a skills crisis in this country? Why can't migrants take those roles?
Well, we could make the effort and train. We have 500,000 people out of work. When I owned Dick Smith Electronics, at one stage we did bring in skilled migrants, but then we decided we'd train them ourselves, and it was a better way to go. It cost a bit more money, but it was a very successful way to go. With 500,000 people out of work, we should be able to train people.
OK, it just feels like there's not a lot of leadership on the matter. Were you going to say something? Sorry.
Oh, I was going to jump in and say we can't blame immigrants for the housing policy issues and the housing crisis. That is not the fault of immigrants. That's not the fault of people that are having babies either. We have people, we should be providing for those people, and we're just blaming the victim if we're saying, oh, our population's too high, that's why we can't house people. That's a political ploy to take the heat off of the politicians that have decades of poor housing policy, have restricted the supply of housing, and even the reduction in immigration over COVID impacted our housing supply because we didn't have the people building those houses. So really, we'd just be shooting ourselves in the foot, and for what? Like, a political ploy, really.
Okay, do you think it's a political ploy?
No, look, the prime reason for high housing prices, they're 4 times harder to buy a house than when I bought my first house in the 1970s, is the huge population increase. We're not blaming anyone, it's just the fact that if in a marketplace, if you bring in an incredible amount of people who are wanting to purchase houses, you're going to put the price up.
But you've done quite well, Dick, in your own career, to be fair. You bought your first house in the 70s, as you said, but some could be looking at this going, well, that's a bit hypocritical of you.
No, look, I've benefited from growth without any doubt. Right. But what I'm concerned about is my grandchildren.
Okay.
And I really believe that if you have too many people, you end up with people getting less.